Hello, learners, and welcome to Chapter 13, where we get to talk about sensory physiology. And what that really means is how you make sense of the world inside of you and also your external environment. Okay, so our focus has to be the peripheral nervous system, as you see here. And what does the peripheral nervous system do? It links the body and brain through sensory pathways. And of course, this is going to be where receptors are converting stimuli into nerve signals. Okay, so there's two ways we're going to be talking about it: the organization of sensory pathways. That means we got to understand what sensory receptors are. So how do we understand the world around us? That's going to be sensory receptors. There's going to be general sensory receptors, different types. They can be classified by different types and location. Then we'll talk about proprioceptors, which is all about receptors in your muscles, your tendons, and your joints to help us understand the space around us when we're like moving around. And then adaptation. That really just means, hey, if I have a stimulus, am I going to keep on firing neural nerve signals over and over and over again, or will my body adapt? So we'll talk about those first. And then next we'll get into the organization of the motor system, what they focus on reflex arch and specifically the stretch reflex. So we'll be going over those two. Okay? And all this, again, is going to help link the brain and body together. And so you want to start thinking about that homeostatic cycle. Where we started off with a stimulus, then we had a receptor. Through an afferent pathway, that message got to the control center, which was the brain. And through an efferent pathway, it was able to send that information or signal back down to an effector to allow a response. So just keep those details in mind as we go along. Now, if we're thinking of the peripheral nervous system in general, we know it's everything that's not the brain and the spinal cord, right? So if we organize ourselves over here, we see the brain and spinal cord is going to be the central nervous system. And everything outside of it, all the nerve bundles outside of it, is going to be our peripheral nervous system. That also means that the peripheral nervous system is going to be the thing that makes us aware of the world around us and helps us navigate it. Okay, and also the world internally as well. Do that, it does it through sensory receptors. Okay, so for example, if I go ahead and pick up something super cold, there's thermoreceptors that are going to be in my skin that says, hey, this is cold. And the way I'll be able to process that information is by making sure I can send out that signal through an afferent pathway to a central nerve. Talking about afferent and efferent nerves. Again, afferent means to arrive at the central nervous system with this actual message, and efferent means that the central nervous system has processed that information and says, hey, send this information through an efferent pathway to the actual effector, and therefore we can have some type of response. Now, efferent, again, means exit. So you're going to be exiting the actual central nervous system to send a message to the effector, which a lot of times can be motor endings, meaning that, hey, if I pick up something hot, I see that it's way too hot, I'm sending, my receptors are going to say, hey, this coffee cup is way too hot. Send a message to the brain's going to say, you need to drop that coffee cup or lay it on the counter. And so that's going to be an efferent pathway to say, hey, go ahead and drop that coffee cup. And then there's going to be a motor, one of your motor endings that are telling you, okay, let's put it down on the actual, counter until everything is basically room temperature. Now, I don't drink coffee, so room temperature coffee doesn't sound appealing, but maybe it'll just be like warm, okay? So here's a little infographic to show you that. Here we have some type of stimulus, and as you can see, our hand is holding a match. Sometimes when you hold that match, it can just start burning very quickly. And so you might be like, oh man, it's getting too close to my skin. You start feeling some of that heat, right? And there's going to be sensory receptors inside your hand that says, hey, heat, 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 heat's happening. There's going to be those thermal receptors. Okay, there's heat, there's heat, there's heat. And then, of course, you're going to sense that heat, and through an afferent pathway, the peripheral nervous system is going to tell the central nervous system, there's heat close to our hands. And there also could be some pain close to our hands. And then what is the central nervous system going to say? Move the hand. How? Through an efferent pathway, so that you can actually go to an effector, which would be like your muscle, and say, hey, move the hand out of the way. And that's how that's going to work. Now, when you're thinking of the peripheral nervous system, remember, this is all about our limbs and, of course, our body, okay? So there are different types of senses that we focus on. It could be the special senses, and there's two types here, special senses and general senses. Our main focus are going to be general senses, but I will be talking a little bit about the special senses. So the special senses are going to be receptors located within sense organs, special sense organs, like your eyes, your ears, okay? Your tongue, for example, your nose. So that's going to include vision, hearing, equilibrium, smell, taste, all of that. But the general senses is going to be majority of the sensory receptors because it's going to belong to your body, right? So these are going to be simple receptors that's going to be focused on touch, pain, temperature, vibration, pressure, proprioception, or where your body is in space and how to move it appropriately through that space, for example. And this is going to be what our main focus is going to, especially when we classify sensory receptors, that's going to be where our main focus is going to hit. Somatosensory system, we are going to be focusing on those general senses. Okay, and the somatosensory system is going to operate at 3 levels to help us be able to get that signal to the brain. Very similar to what we saw before, and also very similar to our homeostatic cycle. So those 3 levels are receptor level, circuit level, and perceptual level. We'll be going through those as we go along. So receptor level is going to be the sensory receptors, all right? So that's going to be the first part here. You have to have some type of stimulus. I'm going to activate those receptor levels, and of course, what's going to happen? An afferent pathway. Afferent pathway's goal is to go to the brain, right? So the brain can process, or that control center. So receptor level is just that stimulus that's going to say, hey, something's happening here. And now we got to transfer that overall stimulus to an electrical signal so it can move down the axon and, of course, the afferent pathway. So, of course, if you're thinking of receptor, you're thinking of graded potentials because we have to hit that negative 55 millivolts, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the circuit level, say you have your stimulus here, then you have your receptor. That afferent pathway, sometimes also you can say ascending pathways because it's going towards the brain, that's going to be your circuit. So it's actually sending that message down the axons into those, and really through nerve bundles to your actual brain, okay? And then we have the perceptual level, which is going to be the processing. Processing where in the brain or the cortical areas. So you'll have the thalamus here, which is going to be processing all the sensory information. So it says, stop. I'm getting a message about some type of sensory receptor. What is the message? And then it'll say, okay, you need to go here, you need to go here, you need to go here. It's almost like a little relay station. And then you'll go up to different parts of the brain, like the somatosensory cortex portion of the brain, which again is going to process information and say, hey, I know what to do. Here's what you do. Go out through an efferent pathway, and then you go ahead and go to an effector, and you get everything done. So you see how it can connect to, again, that homeostatic cycle we've been talking about since chapter 1. To a little bit more detail when it comes to receptor level, because again, it's all about a stimulus, it's all about graded potentials, getting to that negative 55 millivolt threshold, creating an action potential. So again, you can go through afferent pathway or circuit level to get to the brain or the control center. So it's a lot of little details that we have to get into. Let's focus on the stimulus and the receptor. So in order for a receptor to even be triggered to work, it needs a stimulus to excite it. Okay, so the stimulus is going to excite the overall receptor, and if it excites it enough, then of course we can reach to negative 55 millivolts to trigger an action potential, which again will move through an afferent pathway to your actual brain. Another way you can say that is going to move through an ascending pathway in the circuit level to the brain, which is the perceptual level. Okay, so what's the requirements for that signal generation? It needs energy, and guess what? The stimulus energy has to match the specificity of the receptor. So for example, if I have a stimulus here, and that stimulus is going to be pressure. Okay, so meaning I'm holding my pen, and of course I have a certain amount of pressure. Now that's going to trigger our sensory neuron, right? And it's going to trigger what? A receptor that's going to be all about pressure, which will be like called a mechanoreceptor, which we'll get into later. That mechanoreceptor will say, hey, I feel pressure in my hand, and it's going to keep on having that stimulus as I'm keep on holding the pen. And what's going to happen? You're going to form a graded potential. And let's say this receptor is basically on the tip of your finger, because again, I'm holding my pen with the tips of my finger. Okay, so it's going to create a graded potential. If that graded potential is really strong, then what's going to happen? We're going to have a large, if that stimulus is really strong, that means our graded potential can be very large. If that stimulus is very small, that means our graded potential can be very small. Just keep those details in mind. But either way, you know they're going to sum up, and hopefully we get to the negative 55 millivolts, you trigger an action potential, and then you can go ahead and go to the circuit level and go to the brain. Now, guess what? When it comes to receptor level, there are 2 types of graded potentials you have. You can have a generator potential or a receptor potential. A generator potential is the one I just talked about. As you can see, it's just a stimulus going straight to the sensory neuron. That's generator potential. And this is going to be the main one we focus on, because guess what? This is all going to be about the graded potentials that's happening in the body itself. Because remember, somatosensory. Somato means body. So it's like senses of the body. Okay? And the receptor region is going to be part of a sensory neuron. They also are going to be general sense receptors, we just spoke of, and they're going to generate action potential in a sensory neuron. That's the whole goal of it. Once it hits negative 55 millivolts, you're good. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the receptor potential, the other one. As you can see, we have a stimulus here. Let's say that stimulus is light. Light's going to hit a separate cell here. So we're not going straight from stimulus straight to the sensory neuron. We have a separate cell in between. And that separate cell, for example, for light, is going to be our rods and cones in our eyes. So if you're automatically thinking in the eyes, then we know it has to be special senses. And the special senses have separate cells. So it's almost like they're right in the way, like, no, I'll deal with the greater potential first, and then I'm going to send out neurotransmitters to the sensory neuron for us to, see. We're talking about vision here. So the stimulus is going to be light. The rods and cones, or the special cell here, is going to generate their own greater potential. No action potential portion needed. It's just going to generate a greater potential. So then neurotransmitters are released. As you can see, little neurotransmitters are being released. And guess what? They can actually change the amount of neurotransmitters released by the released onto the sensory neuron, which is pretty great. That means you can really tell yourself, okay, well, if there's like bright light, then you might want to release more. So tell yourself, hey, my vision is being blurred because it's a bright light. Maybe I need to figure out if I can get into another environment. Details like that. Okay. And then, of course, once the neurotransmitters hit the sensory neuron, you'll have another greater potential. And of course, if you can sum up that greater potential and get to negative 55 millivolts, then you'll have action potential and goes to a circuit level. So these are going to be receptor potentials. So that's the two types when it comes to receptor level. Let's go ahead and get into circuit level and perceptual level. So circuit level and perceptual level is all about impulses. So remember, this is the goal of just taking whatever the receptor is telling you and send that information to the brain. Okay, so that's kind of the idea behind it. If you have your receptor here and your brain here, the circuit is going to go between the receptor to the brain. So you can think of it that way as well. Okay? Now, what do we mean by this? We're going to have an action potential that's going through an ascending pathway. You can also say afferent to the brain. And then after that, the brain processes everything. And this ascending pathway consists of little neurons. Now, one thing we have to talk about is ganglia. So ganglia are going to be clusters of neuron cell bodies, okay? And then, of course, the axons and everything are going to be the rest of the portion of that neuron. Now, when it comes to circuit level and afferent pathways, or your efferent pathways, we always have ganglia kind of clustered in certain regions. Of course, it's still going to be outside the central nervous system, but then the axons of those different nerves and also those neuron cells are going to be kind of bundled, okay? So these neurons, sometimes you can have 3, sometimes you can have less than 3 or more than 3. That's going to be how you get those afferent pathways or ascending pathways. And then what happens when you get to the perceptual level? Well, you're going to have that input of information go through that relay station or your thalamus, and then the somatosensory portion or cortical portions of your brain to say what's happening here. It's going to process the information, but also interpret the information. And so that means you can talk about, hey, where is the stimulus located? What's the intensity of the stimulus? What are the properties of the stimulus? So, for example, stimulus could be located on my hand. The intensity of it could be, is my hand burning or is it kind of creating blisters, things like that. The properties of stimulus will be like, okay, when I touch the actual stimulus here, or when I kind of touch over the bump that maybe I got bit by a mosquito or something like that, it's kind of looking like very hard in one area, soft in other areas. Like you start processing that information. That's what the perceptual level does. Another example is concrete is hard and rough. So for example, if you're talking about touch receptors, then, and like maybe you hit your hand flat on concrete, you will feel that texture of the concrete itself. And you start processing that information and interpreting where you are as well. Here's an example. Here's our circuit level example. Here's our perceptual level example. So we have a spider in a boot. You go to put your foot into the boot and you feel that spider automatically. You could be scared for some people, and they're going to send through an ascending pathway in a circuit level a message to the brain. The brain's going to process the information and say, hey, there's a spider in my boot. Okay, so keep that in mind as well. Now, for some folks, automatically, after you get the whole goal is for the central nervous system to have an effector, right? There's some kind of response. So some people say the response is, I'm going to quickly remove my foot from the boot. And it can be very, very fast if this is all happening, right? And then some folks might say, I'm not going to remove my foot. I'm going to put my foot deeper in and smash that spider. So everyone is different of how their brain is going to perceptually understand and process, and then, of course, trigger a response for whatever's going on around. Let's go ahead and get into an example on the worksheet. I'm going to focus on number 2. How does the strength of a sensory stimulus, so we're talking about sensory stimulus here, affect the generator potential in sensory receptors? So I see sensory stimulus, I see sensory receptor. They're focused on a generator potential, but remember, this is still a graded potential. It's just 2 types, generator and receptor. Okay? So the focus is going to be generated. Now, what do we know about graded potentials? If you have a large, well, instead of large, we'll say strong. If you have a strong stimulus, then again, you're going to have a large graded potential. And if you have a small, or sorry, a smaller stimulus, or like you can even say weak, then you're going to have a smaller graded potential. Now, with the strong and weak, you can also say large and large, small and small. It is up to you. I'm thinking strong stimulus, again, large graded potential, weak stimulus. But if some folks say I have a large stimulus and then I'm going to have a large graded potential, or I have a small stimulus and a small graded potential, that's not going to be a problem either. So our goal is to see how does the strength of a stimulus affect the graded potential in sensory receptors. So we already know strong is going to give us a larger one or a stronger one. Weak is going to give us a smaller one. Okay, so let's go through the answer choices. A stronger stimuli results in smaller generated potentials. That's incorrect. It's kind of off. They're saying stronger is going to give us smaller when we know stronger is going to give us larger. Okay, the strength of a stimulus is correlated with the strength of a receptor potential. Well, this is actually true. The strength of a stimulus is correlated with the strength of receptor potential. It's the same thing because they're both graded potentials. If they're strong, it's going to be large. If it's weak, it's going to be small, for example. Okay, but the reason why this is incorrect is because they're talking about receptor potentials. They want us to focus on generated potential. Letter C, stronger the stimuli results in a larger generated potentials. That is true. You see that here, stronger, large. And then letter D, generated potentials are not influenced by stimulus strength, just by the presence of a stimulus. That's not true. Again, if it's stronger, it could be larger. If it's weaker, it could be smaller. So the only correct answer here would be letter C. All right, folks, see you in the next video.